Title of the message today is All in the Family. I remember the TV show back in the 70s. It seems like that family was always in crisis of some description, and I think it usually started with Archie. But we've got a couple of Archies in the family this week. What this portion comes from, it's actually in the traditional readings. It's joined with the portion that Wayne taught on last week. It's called Vayishlach, which means, and he sent. You know that a shaliach is a messenger or an apostle. So together with what we studied last week in the portion, together with today's portion, that whole portion together is called Vayishlach, or and he sent. And they really go together. They really do join up together. What it refers to in the traditional sense is the messengers that last week Yaakov sent to his brother Esau. And he sent messengers to talk to his brother. And remember, this is when Yaakov came back to Canaan with his family. And what it's doing is it's now continuing this saga of Yaakov, telling his story. But this week we have an interesting little sidebar. It almost doesn't seem to go with the rest of the story because it just seems like it's, you know in a magazine where they'll put one little page it's called a sidebar. And it doesn't really fit into the article that you're reading, but it's a story all its own, wrapped up in one little portion. And that's kind of what the story of Dinah is here. When Dinah is raped, it's like a little sidebar in this epic of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what we need to try to figure out is, why is this tragedy included in the narrative when it really doesn't on the surface seem to have any bearing whatsoever on the redemption story, does it? Can you really see Yeshua in this portion? It's hard to see. But I think what we're going to find out is that it is a family crisis that takes place. And like we read in the Brit Hadashah, there is also a family crisis occurring in the body of Messiah in the first century. And the two stories are connected. There's more than one kind of messenger in this Torah portion. It's going to be some apostles that are being sent with a good message, at least for the time. Now remember, last week Jacob, journeyed to Sukkot, and he purchased land in Shechem from Hamor, which means he-ass. It's a male donkey. I'm not sure how he earned that name, but nevertheless, we know that these mean things, and if you heard the message at Sukkot, I alluded to his name and told you a little bit more about what it meant, at least prophetically. But this parcel of land is purchased from Hamor, and it says that Yaakov built a house, and he builds Sukkot for his livestock. The sukkah is the little temporary shelter. You've seen the baby in a manger scene. That's a sukkah. It's a temporary shelter. If you look into the Septuagint, then the same word for manger is sukkah. There's a similarity there. It's a place to house livestock or a temporary shelter. But what he told Esau, if you'll remember, he says, I'm not going to push these children beyond their capability. He said, my children are young, and if I try to push them to make this journey in a single day, then it'll be too much for them. So he said, I'm going to let the children follow slowly at the pace of the livestock. And I'm not going to push them beyond their ability. You go ahead. You've got 400 trained men with you. You go ahead to Seir, and I will join you there. But he doesn't. He makes this little side trip, this little thing that sticks out like a sore thumb. He journeys to Sukkot and builds Sukkot for his livestock. And he builds a house. Now, this is only a problem if you remember the vow that he made to Hashem when he first left his father's home. Remember, he had the dream and he saw the staircase or the ladder, and then when he woke up, he said, surely this is the gateway of heaven. You know, God is in this place, and I didn't know it. And so he pours out the oil on the rock there, and he says, if you will bring me back in peace to this land and reconcile me to my family, then I will make this your house. I will return to this place and worship you here. Well, he broke his vow. Because instead of, once he had peace with Esau, his obligation, since he spoke the vow, was to go straight to Beit El and there to worship the Lord at Beit El. But instead, he goes to Sukkot and he purchases land from a male donkey, figuratively speaking. He did not perform his vow, and we know that it's better not to make the vow than not to perform it, or to delay. I think it says in the Proverbs, don't delay to perform these vows that you make, because, you know, like Yeshua said, just let your yes be yes and your no, no. Don't get into a lot of stuff. Don't obligate yourself to God if you don't intend to follow through. It's better not to vow. Yaakov breaks that vow, or at least he delays it for a little while. He's going to have trouble here. Jacob will have trouble. And then he's going to see, oh, I should have been quick to perform that vow. I should have gone straight to Beit El. I shouldn't have camped out at Sukkot. That's what we learned at the Sukkot message, is that he stepped out of time. He tried to circumvent Shavuot. You can't go from deliverance at Passover straight to Sukkot. You must journey through Shavuot. He should have gone back to Beit El. So he does have trouble with a capital T, not only with his daughter, but with the reaction of his boys. Now, just to kind of, I read this passage a lot before I put this together, so I just want to recap for you. I'm going to just assume that you know it as well as I do, and you've read it as many times as I have. But the Shechemites were from a people called the Hivites. That doesn't mean they lived in beehives. What it means is villagers. That's what it means. And if you'll remember them, because remember when the Israelites came out of Egypt and they finally made it into the Promised Land, the Hivites could see that all these other tribes were being destroyed just left and right. And they said, well, hey, wait a minute. Here's what we'll do. We'll dress up in these old clothes and get all this, moldy food and carry with us, and we'll go and we'll tell them we're from far, far away, and we'll make a covenant of peace with them, and we know they won't break their words, and then we'll have peace with them. They can't do anything to us. And they deceived Yehoshua, into making a covenant of peace with them. So the stronghold in the Hivites, or the Shechemites, is going to be a stronghold of deception. And that's been the story of Jacob's life, hasn't it? Deception. If he's not initiating it, then he's on the receiving end of it. And he's about to pass something on to his boys that he probably didn't intend to do. But the Hivites will have a stronghold of deception. And you can see this in the two ways that they presented this proposition to Israel and his sons, and then the different way that they presented it to the Shechemites. Because to Israel, they sit down and they make it sound really good. They say, intermarry with us, give us your daughters, and take our daughters for yourselves. Dwell with us, and let the land be before you. Dwell and move about in it, and have possessions in it. In other words, they're saying, what we have is yours. Now, when they go back to Shechem, and they start to sit these men down and explain to them why they need to be circumcised, and it would have to be a really good argument. They're very cunning, at least the father is. Here's the way he portrays it to the Shechemites. He says, their herds and their possessions and all their beasts, should they not be ours? Very deceitful. Be our family. We'll just get together, we'll be united, we'll be one person. We'll blur the lines that separate us. But when they get back over here, everything they have will be ours. We will assimilate them into us, and not only will you not be able to tell one from the others, everything will be ours. So the way he constructs that is probably very wise, because I don't know that they would have accepted my son is in love with their daughter. Yep. Circumcision, love, probably not. Because the prince, Shechem, he is really the only one who has that true motivation to be circumcised, because he's fallen in love with her. I think Hamor, the he-donkey, is probably the one that's portraying this as a way to acquire possessions. I think the stronghold of greed and deceit rests primarily in him, because at this point we know that the son is contrite. He's repentant about what he's done. And that Yaakov has to learn the hard way most of the time. And the irony is that in Hamor's deceit, he is about to be deceived. This deceit goes back and forth all through this portion of the story of the patriarchs. While at the same time, while they're planning to get Jacob's stuff, Levi and Shimon, they're planning to get their stuff. It's I don't think you could have paid a novelist to sit down and write something any better than this. If you'll notice, too, there was a similarity in a name in the two portions that we read. Shimon is one of the brothers that's crafting the plan here. And over in Acts 15, we read that Shimon had brought a report about the Goyim. So anytime you see a similarity there might be a connection, not just the circumcision issue. So, to recap the story, Dinah kind of goes out, and she goes out without apparently any sort of accompanying protection. She didn't take a brother with her. Apparently she didn't take any of the household servants that could have protected her, because she was kidnapped. She was raped and she was kidnapped as she was socializing there with the local women. And apparently Yaakov, when he hears about it, doesn't get that upset, at least on the outward reaction. He just takes no immediate action. He just kind of sits down and thinks. And you know how frustrating it is when you're all pumped up about something and you're ready to go take heads, and the person that has to be the one that says, let's go get some heads, is the one going, well, let's think about this. Let's think through this. It doesn't really fit with our passion and our anger to go get revenge for what's been done. But that opened the door, that delay in action opened the door for Shimon and Levi. Now remember, these two boys are full brothers to Dinah. They're both sons of Leah, as Dinah is. She's Leah's only daughter. And remember, speaking of deception, Leah was married to Yaakov through deception. Always take the veil off first. He was deceived. So these two boys are going to have a particular sensitivity to deception. All their lives, what do you think their playmates poked fun at them about? Well, you wouldn't even be here if your uncle hadn't, deceived. And I said, oh boy. So they would have known about this deception. It would have been common knowledge. And probably throughout their young lives, they had witnessed their uncle Laban cheating Jacob. Because it says, how many times has he changed my wages? He's always trying to do things to deceive me, supplant me, to take what is rightfully mine, to cheat me. And they watch this happen. And what does Yaakov do? Well, he's just as sneaky. He calls on the name of the Lord, who gives him some ideas, but in turn, he's doing sneaky things back to Laban in order to get the goats and the sheep that he, are rightfully his, that he's worked for, but he will not confront That is one thing Yaakov has not learned to do, is to confront the sin. How many of us do that? We'll run go tell somebody, or we'll figure out these little ways to go around and try to get them back, instead of just walking up to them and saying, "You took my goat." What's so hard about that? We don't have to deceive and sneak around and do things, when we can confront people who take what is given to us by God. The enemy has no power over us except what we give him. So Yaakov is learning this. He's being refined by his uncle Lavan. But don't you know Shimon and Levi are sick of this? They're watching their dad get cheated time after time after time. And these young men are full of zeal. Young men, it's time to do something. And one day Levi's descendants will display a very righteous zeal for the house of the Lord. Remember when they went in among their brothers and start putting people to the sword because of the idolatry? That's righteous zeal. But the zeal that they're about to unload on the Shechemites is not righteous. It's full of deceit. It's full of greed as well, because they end up with the possessions. It's out of its time. It's not allowing Yaakov, as the Goel, the leader of the family, to make that decision. And it even frightened his father Yaakov so bad that he, in effect, curses them on his deathbed. Levi and Shimon's vengeance even scared Yaakov. That's pretty bad when you scare your own parents with your temper. And he says, don't let my name be called in them. No way. But these Levites have a very special gift. Michael Rood said on one of his tapes, if you don't keep the Levites busy on the Temple Mount giving sacrifices, then they get into all sort of weird things. It was the Levites who put together the technology for atomic bombs. You got to keep them busy offering sacrifices, because all they need in a battle is a musical instrument. They're very effective in war. And I can understand why the Levites went before them. They have that zeal for the battle. Except, the Lord said, let's take the sword out of their hands and let's give them a drum or something, or a shofar. We don't quite need that much zeal. I think they're very bitter, probably, against their father, if you think psychologically, how they grew up knowing that their mother was unloved. He didn't hate her. He just didn't love her. And these boys and Dinah grew up seeing that he loved Rachel much more than Leah. And so this vicious plan that they devise, I don't think it's directed so much against the Shechemites as against their father. You can't take vengeance on your father. So what do kids do? They get really frustrated. So, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Why? Because they may not do anything to you, but they'll go out and they'll do something to someone else if they've got all this anger they can't deal with. And by not making a sensible and timely decision, Yaakov has set them up. They did the sin, but all these years he has been setting them up with bitterness. And they're going to send him a message. And I think the message is, you've neglected to love our mother. You've neglected to defend our sister. And so we will fulfill the role of the firstborn. We'll take the reins. You just sit right there in your tent and you contemplate the Torah all you want to. But we're going to go take vengeance for our sister. We will take the role of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, the protector, the defender of the family. You've got the birthright, you've got the blessing, and you've not even collected one sheep from your father. What are we supposed to think of you? We'll do the job. You just keep sitting there. A lot of bitterness. And so in effect, they take the Torah into their own hands. I don't think they ever intended to admit the Hivites into the Israelite family. Even as they sat there and said, here's what we have to do. Don't you know they had already talked about it? Here's Hamor, Shechem, Yaakov, and then the 12 brothers. Maybe not the younger ones, but at least the older ones are sitting around in the tent. What are we going to do now? They had already talked this over, because they walk in and said, okay, we'll join with you, we'll marry with you. All you have to do is look like us. That's how it's worded. We want you to look like us. We want you to be circumcised. Now, Shechem's in love. It's no problem. Hamor's got to go back and convince the men of the city that this is a good idea. But see, that's the twist of this story. The prince is very contrite. He's very repentant. It says that he delights in Dinah. You know, someone that he's taken violently, kidnapped, raped, says he's humbled her. He's taken everything from her a man could take from a woman. And all of a sudden, he falls in love. He has to have her, and he wants to marry her legitimately. No matter what he will do, he says, I'll pay any bride price. Just get her for me. Any price. Take anything I have. Take anything you have. I want that woman. I love her. And we know that he's contrite because it says he didn't even delay to perform it. And I was like, oh man, you know, that is something I would want to think about a little while. But it says that Shechem did not delay. He just charged right in there and took care of it and said, marriage material, here I am, father-in-law. And it also says in the text that he was more noble than all his father's house. So I believe out of all the players and actors in this drama that the one whose heart is really pure at this point is Shechem's. He has truly repented. We also know that later when the written Torah is given, that there are provisions for just such a happening given in the Torah. If a man violates a virgin, he may marry her and pay restitution. That's pretty much what Shechem is asking to do. And I'm sure that Yaakov has an understanding of this. If it wasn't at least codified, there was a general cultural knowledge of this practice. So he's contemplating that. And there was also provision in the Torah for a foreigner, for a goy, to become part of the Israelite community. I'm very sure that these are the two things that he's contemplating before he rushes ahead and gives an answer. I think we can attribute the delay to that. But the hesitancy was fatal to the Hivites. It cost them quite a bit, because while they're overtaken in the pain of circumcision, Shimon and Levi slaughtered them, took their sister back, and pretty much took everything they could carry off. So who can we blame? Are we going to blame Shechem for raping her? Are we going to blame Yaakov for being such a slow decision maker, or maybe having poor parenting skills? You know, these boys feeling left out? Are we going to blame the Hivites for being that gullible? I mean, the whole city at one time? I mean, are we going to blame Shimon and Levi, you know, for executing justice apart from the authority of their father? Are we going to blame Leah for transmitting all her pain and her bitterness of a lifetime to her children? You know, that's something you can pass on to your children, is when you have been injured, when you have been wounded, you can't keep that from your children. And don't you know Leah was wounded every day of her life? Every time she saw Yaakov look at Rachel and know how much he loved her, can you imagine the wound that she's passing on to these kids? Even if she hadn't tried, she would have passed it on. She may have tried. We don't know that. We don't know what the answer to those questions are. All we can ask is, what does this teach us? What does it teach us? So let's look a little more closely at the words. Dinah is a feminine form of the word Din, or Dan, which there was a son named Dan. It means judgment. Now we also know that Torah is a feminine noun as well. And that, among other things, there will be Din contained within the Torah. Judgments are part of what makes up, or what comprises the Torah. And what it may be here is that Dinah is a picture for us of the righteous judgments of the Torah, because that's what her name tells us. So she will be a symbol of Torah, or righteous judgment. Now we know that Shimon and Levi took that judgment, or that Torah, into their own hands. And historically, the tribes descended from Shimon and Levi were partly absorbed into the tribe of Judah. So they were considered Jews after the Assyrian and the Babylonian conquests. Now, parts of them were dispersed, but we know because Yaakov was so terrified by their anger, he did not even give them a land inheritance. He gave them their inheritance kind of scattered in Israel, I believe was the exact words. Now we know that according to 2 Chronicles 11, 13, and 14, that many Levites fled to Judah before the 10 tribes were exiled. So a huge portion of Levi was absorbed into Judah. Likewise, and I'm quoting here from the tribes, likewise a good portion of Shimon was to be absorbed by Judah both before the Assyrian exile and afterwards. Talmudic tradition relates that Shimon was to receive an especial blessing by his affiliation of the tribe with the tribe of Judah. Therefore, what applies to Judah in prophecy also has significance concerning the tribe of Shimon. So when you hear Judah, just go ahead and lump Levi and Shimon in with them. When you hear Jew, understand that they are with, so to speak, Judah. They are mixed in there. So it's possible that these two brothers are going to represent a faction within Judah. Now Yaakov, of course, is the elder. I believe in the brief portion we read, he was called a Zakan. He's also a Goel. He's the kinsman redeemer, the protector of the family, and the one who will be responsible for making the decision, deciding the course of action. This course of action is called halakha. You've heard this word before. In Jewish tradition, when the sages determine practically how you will walk out some aspect of Torah, it's called halakha, which is from holech, to walk. How do we walk this out? This is Yaakov's job, to determine the halakha, how they will walk this out. What are we going to do with Dinah and Shechem? You've got Shechem, and he's a Gentile, requesting admittance to the Israelite clan, and the condition we know is circumcision. Now here's something interesting. The town of Shechem is positioned in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Do you remember what was done on Mount Ebal and Gerizim? We had part of the tribes on this side, and part of the tribes on this side. This side would pronounce the blessings, and this side would pronounce the cursings. Blessing, cursing, blessing, cursing. Now you know from what we studied before that the balance between judgment or cursing and blessing or mercy is called justice. There's a balance in between there. So Shechem is being held right in the balances between judgment and mercy. Now we know that mercy should triumph over judgment, right? Yaakov knows this. And that's as he contemplates, how can I be merciful to these people but yet protect my daughter? When Shimon and Levi take Dinah in their own hands, or judgment, what they do is they tip that scale over to judgment. And instead of mercy triumphing over judgment, and righteousness, justice being done, justice is not done, judgment is done. And Yaakov says, you have made me odious. He said, you've made me smell bad to these people because of what you've done, because they wrestled that decision from their father. Now in Acts 15, we read about another family crisis. And it's the same issue, circumcision. What's the problem? Circumcision. What is the violence that's been done here? I want you to think about this very carefully. If Dinah represents the judgments of the Torah, the righteous principles of the Torah, by the time that the drama takes place in Acts 15, the Jews have endured and withstood centuries of rape, if you will, of the Torah. And you can think of a long parade of names of kings, rulers, and nations who have trampled the righteous judgments of the Torah underfoot. Antiochus Epiphanes. Look at the atrocities that were done because the women would want to circumcise their children. And if they were caught circumcising their children, they'd throw them up and catch them as babies on a sword. And that's just one of the things. As we get closer to Hanukkah, we'll be reminded some of the things that happened under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Herod, the Idumean. You know, Herod was an Edomite. Wayne talked about that last week. It says about this time they ceased to be. This was a very wicked family. Even though they built the temple, they built a wicked administration for the temple. And they continuously raped the righteous principles of the Torah that talks about you can't buy your position with money. You can't make decisions according to how much someone pays you. That whole temple system was driven by money. Rape of the Torah, rape of Dinah. Augustus Caesar, same thing. There's a whole parade of nations who have been trampling the judgments of the Torah. And if the Jews in this instance at any time refused to participate in that trampling, then they often paid with their lives. It would cost you your life if you wanted to keep the Torah many times. And, you know, to the point that John the Baptist went out in the wilderness. At least he didn't have to look at them. In Acts 15, though, the gospel of Yeshua has reached these Gentiles. Good news. And they've repented of their sins, just like Shechem. And their hearts are turned to worship Adonai, the God of the Hebrews. They are truly contrite. And what they're asking is, what do we do now? Okay, we love your Torah very much. We love it as much as you do. Tell us what to do. How can we become part of the family of God? How can we become Israelites? How can we join the clan? How can we take and give in marriage? You know, we truly love this woman. She's beautiful to us. We'll do whatever you ask us to do. We'll pay any bride price. Name the price. If it's circumcision, we'll do it. We delight in His Word. Just tell us what to do. And to some of the Jews, the answer is circumcision. So if you're going to be saved, there's a key word. If you're going to be saved, you're going to have to be circumcised. But to others, this isn't really clear. James is the leader of the Messianic Beit Din in Jerusalem. A Beit Din is a council, a court. And he is the leader of the Messianic court in Jerusalem. It's called the Jerusalem Council. And what he has to do is lead the other elders to a righteous judgment concerning these Gentiles and how they will be admitted to the Israelite family. He has to determine the halakha, how they will walk out their faith. He's got to set down the guidelines and the rules. And not so coincidentally, remember I said names mean things? We've already heard from Shimon. James is the English derivative of Yaakov. It's still Yaakov making the decision. It's still Yaakov the elder, the Goel, who's going to determine the course of action. Hundreds of years after Jacob's first trouble, the second Jacob, James, Yaakov, is also going to have to come to a family decision. And he has to protect the interests of the family as well. He can't just figure out what's best for the Gentiles. He has to figure out what's best for the family. And remember, as Yeshua's half-brother, he had a vested interest in protecting the interests of the family. This wasn't a casual decision. This was his flesh and his blood that he must protect, the living Torah. Now, according to Galatians 5, we know that Paul was so angry with the faction that was demanding circumcision, he said he wished they would go ahead and emasculate themselves, which seems a little drastic. But he's very angry with them because what they're teaching is covenant out of order. Just like Yaakov was out of order to go to Sukkot before he went to Betrayal, he's saying that these Jews demanding circumcision for salvation are out of order. Circumcision comes later. There is a circumcision of the heart that takes place first. You believe and you walk in faith, just like our father Abraham. We know that the Mosaic covenant represents your spiritual walk after you're saved. Your salvation covenant is faith, but your spiritual walk is contained in the Torah. It tells you how to walk it out, halakha. You can't earn or keep your salvation by human works. Keeping the Torah will not earn or keep your salvation. This is what Paul is saying. On the other hand, we know that Yaakov, the elder, says in his book, or his letter, that salvation without works is dead in our spiritual walk. See the covenant order? Salvation, faith. Walking out spiritual life is obedience to the Torah. You'll learn that in Ha-Yesod if you haven't already. So the faction of the believing Jews who are trying to factor in circumcision somehow to salvation are the Shimons and the Levis of the family. They're repeating the error of their ancestors. And I would bet you anything that many in this faction demanding circumcision never intended for these Gentiles to be admitted as full members of the family. I bet you behind it all, one of two things was going on. They're either going to punish them for times past. I don't care if he is contrite. I don't care if he does want to marry her legitimately. I can't forget what you've done to me and my people over the last few hundred years, and I'm going to get you back. And maybe they thought that, if they put circumcision on them and start loading them down with the yoke of tradition, they'll get discouraged, they'll quit, and they'll go away, and they'll leave us alone. They won't trouble us anymore. Maybe it was a way of bringing them in, more tithe money, Who knows what they were thinking? Shimon and Levi certainly wanted the goods when it was all over with. I think many of them were like Shimon and Levi. They just could not forget and forgive. And they also wanted to wrestle that authority from Yaakov, James, and the Jerusalem Council. Pull it away and say, let me decide. Let me decide the halakha. Let me tell them what to do. And, like Shimon and Levi, I think there were genuinely people among them who thought it would be a disgrace to give their sister to a man who was uncircumcised. How can we give our Torah, our living Torah, into the hands of a Gentile that's not even circumcised? They don't even know how to act. We're supposed to give the most precious thing on earth to them? You can understand some of the reservations and thoughts that are going through their heads. But I believe a lot of them felt like they would be disgraced for allowing these goyim to come into their synagogues uncircumcised. Whereas if they could present them to the unbelieving Jews circumcised, that somehow it would be a feather in their caps. Look what we did. We took these goyim and we got them circumcised, and now they're Jews. They weren't interested in discipling the family of Elohim. They were interested in presenting people into the Jewish tradition. That's wrong motive. Very wrong motive. They were more concerned about circumcision of the flesh than the heart. So what did the Jerusalem Council think as they contemplated all these issues? How could they honor the Torah, protect the sister, and still admit the Gentiles in without giving them a separate or subordinate status? Well, one thing we can do is we can go back to the rabbinical writing from that era, and we can find out what the sages were thinking about this issue. If you'll read Monk's The Call of the Torah on page 207, you can find some of these two different viewpoints. There's really two schools of thought. Now, each of them has a valid argument, I think. One view says that the Gentiles, like Abraham, should first learn the Torah and walk in it before they accept the physical sign of circumcision. Now, this is coming from the rabbis. After all, once you accept circumcision, you've pronounced yourself mature and proficient in Hashem's pattern of righteousness. And you've obligated yourself to walk in the whole Torah. Wow. It doesn't mean that you won't sin, but it sets you up as an example to the believing community, and your life says, this is the way to walk in the Torah. Follow me. Remember what Paul said? Follow me as I follow Messiah. That's what they think that circumcision says. Just like Abraham had to reach an age of maturity, remember he said, walk before me and be perfect. Okay, you're circumcised, you must be perfect. And the reasoning behind this says that accepting the seal of the covenant in the flesh after a growth period is that unlearned and ignorant Gentiles would not be held up as examples in the community. In their blundering, they might cause others, especially others ignorant of God's word, to stumble at the Torah. And we know that this is the view that Paul held to adamantly. That was his position, the one that I've just read. And I can guarantee you, if Paul circumcised Timothy, he had no problem with Timothy walking in the Jewish community. There was no question. There was no way Timothy would bring any sort of reproach to the Jewish community. And I'll also tell you this, he was a mature believer if he circumcised him. Because this is the rabbinical school of thought that Paul is teaching in his letters, especially in Galatians. And we experience the same problem. We can't look back and say how dumb they were. Why was it such a big issue? Because, let me be careful. Because I don't want you to think I'm saying something I'm not saying. I'm not telling you don't wear tallits, don't wear kippahs, and all this other stuff. But I have seen people very precociously wear the symbols of Judaism without the maturity that goes with it. What they're doing, they'll run around maybe with tzitzit, and you'll see them sit down maybe at Denny's and order the Grand Slam breakfast with extra bacon. See what they're walking around saying, I've achieved maturity, but what they're doing is bumbling around through the Torah. You know, it's fine to wear a kippah, but if you're running around the community telling stories on your brothers and sisters here, you are still bumbling in the Torah. And you need to achieve a level of maturity towards your brothers and sisters before you start running around the community with the outer vestments of Judaism. Because in a lot of cases, the vestments of Judaism are their particular halakha of how you walk this out. A talit, they say, is how we put the fringes on our garments, and that's how we're walking it out. Are there other ways to wear a fringe? Absolutely there are. You know, and you can be very discreet with it until you've learned more about even what you're doing with those emblems. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be wise. Don't get the cart ahead of the horse, because it's wonderful. You start learning these things and you just want to put it on. You got to try it on. It looks so good. And you want to understand it. Your heart is like Shechem. Your heart is tender toward this beautiful Torah, and you want to do anything you can. But you have to be so careful not to hold on to the traditions and the emblems before you hold on to the Word itself and learn how to act like an Israelite. We want to be very careful what kind of example we set for both Jews and Gentiles outside our congregation. So be very careful with those symbols. Make sure that you've committed in your heart, and you and the Father only know the condition of your heart with what you're doing. We can't judge that. Now, I can judge that bacon. But nevertheless, I've got to allow you a growth period. And say, sooner or later, you know, they're going to get the muffin or something. But we need to give our flesh a period of time to be disciplined by the Torah that's written on our heart before we present ourselves as of the circumcision covenant, because it does tell people that you consider yourself mature. And that sign of the circumcision goes on the procreative organ. Why? It's a reproductive organ. It says that you are able to bear fruit in the kingdom. You are producing children, sons and daughters for the kingdom. You are discipling them. You are bringing them to maturity, and you have actually become the shaliach. You have become the messenger of the kingdom that is able to carry this gospel of Yeshua and follow His commandments and teach others to follow His commandments just like He said. So you're actually seen as a family messenger, an apostle, someone carrying the word out. And that's why you need to be aware when you're talking about the circumcision sign or any of these other outward signs, be sure that that's where you're walking. So that, the perception that people have won't be that it's just a toy you're playing with. Now, the other school of thought comes from sages who believed, and obviously this is the one that traditional Judaism goes with. This comes from sages who believed that after a brief instructional period of the Torah, in which time a person is called a proselyte of the gate, a Gentile should be circumcised. It's interesting that they convinced the Shechemites to do this at the gates of the city. Once he was circumcised, he was then called a proselyte of righteousness. And they felt that if a man entered a covenant relationship, then he should immediately put that sign of the covenant upon his flesh, that he should accept the circumcision. Now, they would continue to instruct him, but it's like, okay, you're circumcised, now we can talk to you. And, still, I believe there were many who did it out of an honest heart because they didn't know, they weren't instructed in Torah. And if someone who does know it is telling you be circumcised, that's all you know to do is be circumcised. And I think God honored their faith, their childlike faith. He alone knows what's in your heart. And He might tell you to keep a commandment you don't completely understand. And if you step out in faith because it's in your heart, He will honor that, even though you didn't completely. I learn every week what Shabbat's all about, but at some point I had to step out and do it first. And that's what this school of thought is saying. You got to step out in faith, take the sign of circumcision, and the rest will come later. But that'll be a sign to us that you're serious. And that's the other school of thought. Now, these are the two ways of thinking that James and the other elders are weighing out as they listen to all this testimony in Acts 15. Then they have to take counsel after they listen to Paul and Barnabas and Shimon. And they're going to have to weigh it against what we just learned in the Torah lesson. That we have to focus our zeal on the purposes and the programs of Elohim, not on ours. And that's the temptation, is to focus our zeal on our program. And we just hope His fits in with ours. That's what this faction is doing. They have an agenda, and they're just using the Torah and sticking it in their agenda, rather than really looking into it and allowing the elders to make a decision. And I believe they made it exactly on this Torah lesson. Now, I think the council also knew what Ramban tells us. In his commentary, he says that the motives of the Hivites were all wrong. He says, the covenant by which they had circumcised themselves had no value, since it had been made to flatter their masters. Later on his deathbed, the patriarch, Jacob, cursed Shimon and Levi's anger because they had violated the trust of the Shechemites by declaring to them, and we will dwell with you and we will become one people. The Hivites might perhaps have repented and returned to God. Thus they had slain them without cause, for they had done them no evil at all. There's really only two guilty parties. Shechem has raped and kidnapped. Hamor has been a party to the kidnapping because the girl is still held in his city. I mean, they're negotiating, but they still got the girl while they're negotiating. It'd be like if I went out and took your car and the keys and took it back to my house and asked you to sell it to me. I've got the car already. If you tell me no, I might go back and do violence to the car before I give it back to you. So they're aware of all these things. They've got to make sure that that balance is held and that it tips this time just a little toward mercy. But that circumcision was from wrong motives. They have to make sure that no one is being circumcised just to look like an Israelite, because that's what Shimon and Levi were after. And we also have to be very careful that we don't do what we do just to look like Jews. We're going to unify with Judah out of heartfelt obedience to the Torah, not because we look like them or dress like them or necessarily pray like them, even though I think there's a case for at least the Shmoni Esrei, because Cornelius prayed it. You don't need a stack full of letter and Messianic Jewish catalogs to keep the Torah. We can do it without that. The things in those catalogs make it easier. If I need some tzitzit, it's much easier to call them up, 1-800-4-YESHUA, and say, send me some tzitzit. And I don't have to worry about how that's going to happen, because it arrives in the mail, I put it on, and I go on. They will make commandment keeping easier, but you don't have to buy everything in the catalog to walk out a Torah life. I think also they are aware that, at least from the Hivites' point of view, not only did they do it to look like the Israelites, they were greedy. They wanted their stuff, and they got to make sure that these goyim don't have the same agenda. What they've got to try to do is figure out, separate all this stuff that we've talked about for the last 50 minutes and come up with the right answer. Now, as the leader of the family, Yaakov makes this decision. We should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. You know, the Shimons and the Levis of the family, he's saying, sit down, shut up, and let us make this decision. And let us do it right this time. Let's not repeat the mistake. They learn from the examples of the Scriptures and Yeshua's own teaching that submission to spiritual authority is very important, and forgiveness to a repentant sinner is crucial. We can't hold sins over someone's head, and we must submit to spiritual authority. Because Yaakov had prophesied of trouble that would come to him because of Shimon and Levi, the second Yaakov says, I don't want Jacob's trouble. I'm not going to summon Jacob's trouble. Let's do it right. And I believe that the instructions, the 4 instructions to the Gentiles, well, I'll say 5, in Acts 15 are based on this very parashah, starting from last week's. Here's the decision. Therefore I judge, done, that we should not trouble, interesting choice of words, those from among the Gentiles who are turning to Elohim, but that we write to them to abstain from the defilements of idols, and from sexual sin, and from what is strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moshe has in every city those proclaiming him, being read in the congregations every Shabbat. The first requirement is to abstain from things polluted by idols. Now, in this very parashah, Yaakov had to confront the idolatry in his own family. Remember? Rachel kept the little household idols, brought a curse on herself. For once he had to confront and say, we get rid of this stuff here, and he buries it under a tree. He realizes, I think, at this point that he's failed to quickly perform his vow. He said, we got to get rid of this idolatry before I can even approach him at Beit El to say I'm sorry for taking so long. He sees that he's had trouble, so it says under the terebinth, or under the pistachio tree in Shechem, Yaakov ordered his family to give up their idols, and he buried them there. The Gentiles have to do the same thing. If you're coming into the family of Elohim, if you want to be an Israelite, bury the idols. Get rid of them at Sukkot. What is Sukkot? It's a sukkah. It's a temporary shelter. Every time you see a little Christmas scene, you're looking at a little sukkah. It might be that the very first idol you're going to be asked to give up and bury under the tree is your baby in a manger, because it's not time for Sukkot. You were supposed to go to Beit El, where you received the promise. Put away the idols, bury them under a tree. We also know that in Scripture, covetousness is defined as idolatry. If you have a problem with greed, you need to bury that under the tree as well. I believe this instruction was taken directly from this parashah. The second instruction was to abstain from sexual sin, rape, fornication, and adultery. We know that this is because Dinah was raped. So, possess your physical vessel in honor. And remember Dinah. Don't ever do her like that. The third requirement is the Torah of blood. Now, this doesn't have so much to do with the blood of meats, because that's addressed separately. This has to do with the bloods of separation between a man and a woman, We know that at certain times when a woman is in her monthly flow, she is to be separate from her husband. She is not to have relations with her husband. That's what this is referring to. You're saying if you want to come into this community, we want you to observe that period of separation during the time of blood. Where did they get that? Remember when Uncle Lavan came looking for the idols? Why didn't Rachel get up? She said, "It's my time. I can't get up. You can't touch this." Well, this council is upholding that. Even though she was concealing idols by using that as an excuse, she may have actually been in her monthly time. I believe she probably was. But she used that to conceal the idolatry. So they're saying, separate yourselves during that time. Show some respect for one another. And it wouldn't hurt probably to learn the blood laws given in Leviticus so that you can understand this better. And I believe that stands today. The fourth requirement was to abstain from things strangled. Now, if you look in Harper's Bible Dictionary, it will tell you that that Greek word, that classical Greek word, means things that have not been slaughtered in a kosher manner. Oh, well, we just opened up a whole can of worms, didn't we? Because you can't slaughter non-kosher animals in a kosher way. It won't happen. So he's asking them to discipline their eating habits. We know that in kosher slaughter, we know that first of all the animal's healthy, that it wasn't afraid or terrified when it was slaughtered, that the blood was properly drained into the earth, and that it was actually fit for human consumption, that it is fit for a family of Levites and priests. Why? What was the purpose of that? So that they could join the Jews in table fellowship. You can sit down at the table and they can come to yours if you're eating kosher. You can talk. You're going to hear Moshe in the synagogue, but you may not understand him. Where will you learn to understand him? In the discipling process that takes place over a table. That, in the first century, is where believers really, had a meeting. They would meet in homes, meet over food, break bread, and they would expound and glorify the Word. They're saying if you would limit, put a boundary on your appetite, then you can come in and eat with us and we can eat with you. And we can teach you everything you need to learn about Moshe. You can
If you'd like a copy of this program or are interested in starting your own Messianic congregation, please write to the Olive Branch, Highway 80 East at Sally's Branch Road, London, Kentucky 40744, or phone us at 606-862-0878, or visit our website at theolivebranchonline.com.